Hello and welcome to The Y Word, the podcast that gets under the skin of entrepreneurs, business people, artists, and anyone who changes the world and finds out why they do what they do. In this episode, you will hear.
I'm acutely aware of the privilege I have to have been born to two very smart working class West Indians who came here in the 1950s when life was very rough, and to get to wherever they needed to go and do whatever they needed to do, they had to be inventive, pragmatic, and remain buoyant and resilient in the face of not much encouragement. The vast majority of people that I have to photograph, whether they're famous, used to it, or novices, or somebody thrust into the limelight unexpectedly, are not really sure they're worthy of the attention, not sure they're attractive enough, not sure because of past experiences how likely they're going to be made to look good this time. Unfortunately, I'm not a saint. I like having a good time and I like having comfort and resource. So there was that to it as well.
Today I'm talking to Robert Taylor. Robert is one of Britain's most celebrated portrait photographers. His work's been exhibited in the National Portrait Gallery and he regularly takes commissions from high-profile organisations. One recent commission from an Oxford college saw Robert replacing the refectory's paintings of old dead white men with photographs of the college's very much alive and very illustrious women alumni. Robert Taylor, let's talk about that Oxford commission. How did it all come about?
Well, I had already, I suppose for the previous 10 years, become very caught up in a long stream of commissions to create portraits of women achieving at the highest levels in science, engineering, and technology, areas of endeavour largely dominated by men. So a remarkable stream of women. And it was perhaps inevitable that that would spill over into Oxford and the world of academe, asking me to take portraits because I was used to handling amazing women.
And what sort of people were you photographing for this particular project?
They'd usually be fellows of the Royal Society, often damed. They tend to be leading great research teams or were brilliant teachers or were amazing mentors and encouragers of other clever women who needed to be shown what was possible. And very often, the very best of them combined all three of these characteristics.
What was it like going into that room and seeing all these old paintings being taken down and replaced?
On the one hand, they are beautiful paintings. I mean, the aggrandizement of establishment males is a very well-accomplished phenomenon, and they make themselves look great. So my first thought was, oh my God, I'm going to be a lightning conductor for all kinds of mania when the women replace these men. And then just the feeling of, well, excitement as well as terror, because you see people walking into that room experiencing something they were not expecting.
Okay, so what's the reaction that you got when people did finally walk in and see it up in real life?
The exhibition was hung and we were just putting the finishing touches to it, and it was a student open day, a prospective student open day. So mid-teens were coming along in small groups to be shown around the college to prime them for the possibility that they might end up there as undergraduates. And I was up a ladder quietly noticing how as young women came in, they'd be looking around and double taking and then looking around and realizing it was only women. And I didn't get the chance to ask any of them about this, but it was thrilling to see them noticing something they were not expecting to see.
Yeah, because Oxford does have this, history going back hundreds of years. And if you change it, how does that change? Well, does it change people's response to what the institution itself actually means?
I hope so. I'm told that it does, but it's a difficult thing to quantify. The fact is, I think these great institutions have been doing a marvellous job of balancing the great wealth of tradition with the need to be leading in their fields of research and erudition. And the fact is, most Oxford University institutions that I've come in contact with are now fully functionally co-educational. Women are there at the highest levels. They even have a female vice-chancellor. And I think they handle it very well. But this issue of messaging, this issue of showing people by what you hang on the walls and how you organize the buildings is one of the later hurdles that they need to really cross to convince people that it's happening. But in many practical ways, it already is happening.
Robert, it's good that you say that, because culture change is one of those things that we talk about a lot on the Y Word. So what is the culture that Oxford is trying to change?
Oxford University is described, it's the one that I know most about, is described as an institution. It's actually a very large herd of very idiosyncratic cats that cannot really be herded. So every time I go into a new commission at Oxford University, I'm meeting a different bunch of characters, a different set of traditions, different budgets, and different ideas about how far they want to push the boundaries. So it's very hard to generalize about what happens at Oxford, but it's definitely a place in flux in a very exciting way.
I'd love to talk to you about this moment where you start photographing people, because I should imagine that most people suddenly get very self-conscious and don't want to do anything unless they've got hair and makeup done. Is this still the case with your subjects? And if it is, how do you overcome that?
The vast majority of people that I have to photograph, whether they're famous, used to it, or novices, or somebody thrust into the limelight unexpectedly, are not really sure they're worthy of the attention, not sure they're attractive enough, not sure because of past experiences how likely they're going to be made to look good this time. So I start every session on the assumption that we're at the bottom of a pretty deep pit, and people need to be taken care of, they need to be involved, they need to be given as much information as possible beforehand without overwhelm about what we'll be doing it, how we'll be doing it, where we'll be, what kind of decisions are going to work in their favor about what they're wearing. And at the other end of the scale, I've always been lucky enough to persuade my institutional clients that we should build into that process a chance for the subjects of these pictures to have some say about which version of them would actually get hung, which is something that's much more difficult to do in the traditional oil-painted portrait process for obvious reasons. So it's really about taking care of people and gently and subtly giving them the experience of being celebrated and explored and discovered rather than having something done to them. It's a collaboration.
Right. So those of us that like turning a camera on our friends and our family, we shouldn't be trying to, take their photo. We should be trying to capture the whole moment, maybe.
Well, I'm not one to dish out lectures on how casual social photography should be done, because if we're with our near and dear, there's a different level of trust and acceptance, I guess. But as somebody who is terminally vain and narcissistic myself, I have bags of empathy and sympathy for people who are going to be exposed to my lens.
And you've been doing this for long enough that you can remember the old days of film. Where are you more comfortable? Is it digital or film? And do you prefer one or the other?
I have no problem with digital whatsoever now. There was an anxiety in the early days before the quality at the highest level just wasn't quite there. And I was running two sets of equipment depending on the kind of shoot I was doing. But now I can only welcome it for the ease with which pictures can be taken, processed, and disseminated. Yes, of course, if I could redesign the clock to have 48 hours of the day, I'd love to go back and luxuriate in the old technology. But frankly, I'm very, very happy with it. And the kind of photographs that I take really are not subject to some valid discussions about whether the old technology would bring a certain subtle, different atmosphere. That's just not an issue in my work. But I do respect the anxieties of those who luxuriate and are very skilled in the old technology.
Now, you've used two very emotive words quite close together. One of them is anxiety and one is vanity. I was going through some photos on my phone and I couldn't help but think, goodness, Ian, you're so vain. There's so many photos of you. And then I realized it's anxiety. I'm constantly trying to find a good photo of myself.
That's why I have so many.
So many photos of myself. But seriously, we've got Facebook and Instagram and all these others. Is it really about vanity, or is it about anxiety on these social media platforms that we all display our lives on?
Well, I'm not going to try and save mankind in one short answer. There are different contexts in which pictures are taken. The people who I'm sent to photograph by institutions who have big and important statements to make about who they are, what their priorities are, and what their values are, require a great deal of sensitivity about how it's handled so that the right messages get through in as far as they can. I still love the serendipity and wildness of most of the photographs that are taken these days. I love the democratization of this process of recording who we are and making statements about ourselves. I, of course, have anxieties about the Instagram phenomenon and picture retouching. When I photograph people, one of the things I say to them is, I am not going to be indulging in massive retouching and remodeling and trying to make you look like somebody else. The purpose of my photograph of you is to celebrate who you are at your best. I don't want somebody who's seen a photograph of you before they've met you to vaguely recognize you and realize how much work was done to make you into somebody else. That is not doing anybody any favors. And my anxiety about the retouching and Instagram culture is it's creating just legions of people with accentuated anxieties about not being good enough. Let's celebrate the best of what's actually there.
Oh, I agree with that. But you seem to have a very creative life. And I would actually describe you as having a more handmade life than most.
Would you like to explain what you mean by that?
Well, okay. Other people would go out and buy clothes, but you design and make your own. You design and make your own jewellery. You have a sewing machine, which not everybody has or indeed even wants. What is it that makes you need to create stuff out, from your own imagination and see it happen in the world?
If I've understood your question or your inquiry, I think this is a great opportunity for me to go back to something that really, really matters to me about my values and how my life works. I'm acutely aware of the privilege I have to have been born to two very smart working class West Indians who came here in the 1950s when life was very rough, and to get to wherever they needed to go and do whatever they needed to do, they had to be inventive, pragmatic, and remain buoyant and resilient in the face of not much encouragement. So I guess I've always been used to seeing restrictions and hurdles and challenges as much as opportunities to invent ways round, rather than, oh, woe is me, what am I going to do? It's just, life happens, deal with it.
Now, on the Y Word, dear listener, we quite often divide the interview up with the business in the first half and the personal in the second half. But with somebody like Robert Taylor, it's quite tricky finding out where one ends and the other begins. That is the nature of interviewing an artist. I wanted to explore with Robert this idea that his parents had really struggled to provide for him and his family, and what it was like trying to pursue a career that, some might say is not a quote-unquote proper job.
Well, I'm very glad it's not a proper job. One of my great happy accidents in life has been to never quite get what proper meant or feel obliged to blend in with what proper is. I mean, I did have a crack at it in my early life. I served in the British Royal Air Force. I qualified as a barrister. I was even a thrusting young publishing executive for a while, living the so-called 80s dream. Luckily, I got a chance to wake up and reclaim my life and get on with things that were fun and challenging sometimes, but really gave me a sense of being alive. And yes, you have to keep thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and is it sustainable? But it's been a life I'm really grateful for. Now, I understand mixed into all that apparently appealing formula is an incredible amount of luck, a stream of fantastic encounters with people who were contributions to me, asking questions, supporting me, or in some cases, pushing me hard to think again.
I remember once a teacher jokingly saying to me, because I couldn't do some quite serious thing because I was going off to do some drama out of school thing. They said I needed a stint in the army to knock the art out of me, which was an obvious joke. But I just wondered what the RAF did for you.
I'm still trying to work this one out 40 years later. It was initially a strategic move to get me out of a household where I needed to get out of. It was also one of the more respectable ways to have that distance and not feel as if I was trying to be the new James Dean. It was an excellent opportunity to pause and think about who I was, what was really important. And although I quite enjoyed it and, enjoyed being a successful novelty there, I quickly realized I'd ended my formal education far too soon. And that prompted the jump back into education, taking my law degree and qualifying as a barrister. So to answer your question, well, that's as far as I can go, really. It was a great pause moment to work stuff out and then dive back into my life. And it worked extremely well.
I have to ask, the RAF thing, is that an attempt to fit in? Because you grew up in Birmingham, but Robert, that is not a Birmingham accent I can hear.
I'm a 6'2" black man. And there's very few places that you blend in. So the RAF for me was, it was a given that I was going to stand out in most of the situations I was in. And it's been a given in most of the things that I've actively chosen to do. And that's fine.
But I also wonder if it's good for your parents to look at you and say, yes, our son has joined the RAF. That is an obvious big tick. Our son is a success. We have done well. We have achieved what we should achieve as good parents.
I was, up until the age of about 18, an industrious little harvester of brownie points. I would negotiate the world, working out what might pass muster, perform it, do it, achieve it, or create it, and then move on to the next opportunity to get more points. Part 2 of my life has been about realizing that amusing and rewarding as that process is, it is incredibly limited, and one can overinflate the importance of what other people think or say or want. Part 2 of life has been trying to find ways, without becoming a completely self-absorbed monster, to find ways to do things that work for me and for the people that I'm with.
But look at your career. You've gone RAF, then you've gone barrister, then you've gone publishing executive, then you've gone to photographer. Lots of people shy away from change. You're not just embracing change, you're embracing transformation. That's change on steroids.
The earlier phase was just not being fully aware. It was just about passing muster. Part 2, I've spent more than half my life as a photographer now. The accident of being a photographer, it is one thing, but it is countless things. I can remember one extraordinary week when I was at Marlborough House in Pall Mall as the official photographer for the Save the Children Fund's, 75th anniversary. And I was commissioned to take a quick picture of Princess Anne with Alan Wicker. And at the other end of the week, I was becoming perhaps notorious as the photographer for a highly explicit safer sex guide for gay men, co-created with Peter Tatchell. That was one of those weeks that really told me it's very hard to define what I do and what its purpose is.
But surely the purpose of what you do is always to, find the opportunities in change, not just to be different, but to reinvent. Are you one of life's great personal self-reinventors?
Well, this question is so current now. After 30 relatively happy years doing what I do, I've been allowing myself to seriously consider when and how I'm going to stop being a photographer. I'm realizing, is it time to just reclaim photography as a hobby and give my real energy to other things? And I've more or less decided I'm not yet done with photography. There's still some things I need to explore. And it's just doing the work of breaking the habits of always lighting and positioning and organizing and administering and exhibiting in the ways that I have in the past, and not be distracted by the old habits that demand my time and attention.
Well, breaking out of old habits is something that very often needs an outside point of view. Have you had any mentors that have really changed the way you see the world?
I've had several mentoring relationships as the mentee. The most potent was meeting and becoming friends with the late, great photographer Rotimi Fani Kayode. He had a fine art Western training, then settled in London and was making a great name for himself as an artist with a camera. Sadly, he died just over 2 years after we'd become friends, but it was meeting him and seeing what was possible with photography as an identity and as a means of expressing oneself and trying to change the world that changed my life radically. And he was an incredibly generous mentor, encourager, And I know that I'm only where I am now because of that relationship over 30 years ago. Treating photography seriously as an art form with something important to say made me realize, not that I wanted to be exactly like him, but that I could find my own voice and find my own way and commit myself to using my camera and its opportunities. Unfortunately, I'm not a saint. I like having a good time and I like having comfort and resource. So there was that to it as well.
I think as well, if you're going to be creative, you have to be prepared to create something that's not good, because otherwise you just become bound up in trying to achieve a perfection that maybe you can't because your own standards are far too high in the first place.
Well, this has not always been a challenge, and I guess it will always be the challenge. I know that anything that's really been satisfying produced that I'm really proud of has usually, if it's a project rather than a photo session, involved a fair degree of anguish and research and wondering and occasionally false starts. And it's doing that work and being at risk that creates the opportunity to do something that's really fresh and new.
Fresh and new is a good place to end it. But before we go, one last question. It's the dinner party game, but of course, my twist is it's a business lunch. Who would you like to join you for a business lunch? Be they alive, be they dead, be they fictional? Robert Taylor, tell us who your guest is.
Well, let's say they got to have huge amounts of money and an imagination. I would love to get my hands on, let's say, Bill Gates, as he's already evinced some interest in making his wealth mean something, and infect him during our lunch with a newfound passion for the arts. Not buying it, not owning it, not running it, but generating an enlightened injection of resource and imagination such that more people would feel that the arts were for them, more artists would get a chance to make amazing work that enriched all of our lives, and generally put a fire under people's rather limited ideas about what their lives mean and how much power they have to change and shape them. And this is a big role for the arts, which I think is woefully undervalued. The reason that I still get a thrill out of photographing people, and it doesn't really matter whether they're royal or famous or ordinary or whatever, is every single session is an opportunity to explore and discover and celebrate something. And one of the thrills I get is creating the collision between people's anxieties and concerns and low self-image with the discovery that they are worth the attention, that they have a beauty about them, not because of how they look, but how they are and what's the very best of them. And it moves me deeply still when people see something else in themselves that they didn't necessarily see. And it doesn't have to be revelatory and life-changing, but just to think, oh, gosh, the fact that I have for the last 15 years been photographing mature women and celebrating their charisma, their ability, their charm, their capacity to change the world, rather than taking photographs that are judging how well their hair is, what their body shape is, or what clothes they wear, it is thrilling at its best.
Well, on that note, that seems like a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for being my guest today. If you'd like to find out more about Robert Taylor, his website is going to be on the show notes at the bottom of this program. That's also where you will find my LinkedIn page. Please get in touch. I love having conversations with people, especially if you know of someone who would be a fantastic guest to have on a future episode. I'd also encourage you to share with your friends, share with your colleagues, and hit the subscribe button, because I've got some great guests coming up and it would be lovely to have you along for the ride. That's all for today. Have a great time. Until the next time.